Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Steven Springer. I'm Senior Executive Producer here at Voice of America, and one of my major responsibilities here has to do with best practices, standards, and ethics in journalism. And sitting to my left is Sharon Behn from our Central Newsroom.
Hi, everybody.
Why don't you tell them a little bit about what you've done?
I've worked for VOA for 5 years. I worked in Afghanistan and Pakistan as a bureau chief for 2 years. And before coming to VOA, I have been a global correspondent. I've been to East Africa and Iraq and Central Asia, Russia, Latin America, many other different places. And I've worked with different organizations. So I come with a background of many different kinds of media organizations.
I've been with VOA for a little over 6.5 years. Actually started out here as the managing editor for our Central Newsroom and moved into my current position, almost 5 years ago now. I spent 23 years at CNN. Most of that was working on special events, big coverage, but my last 2 years there was working in the Standards and Practices department at CNN, which kind of led to me doing this work here. So it's something where I'm in contact with all of our language services, Central News on an almost daily basis, just making sure that we're doing the best job we can as journalists to be as honest and as fair in our reporting as we possibly can be. Just to a little visual aid, we have what's called the Best Practices Guide, which is about 90 pages. I update it regularly. It goes out to all the journalists at VOA, both here in Washington and overseas. We post it on our internal website so everybody can have a copy. And it's basically, the reason we call it a guide and not a manual is because, as you can probably realize, the lines in terms of what constitutes best practices or ethics keeps changing now day to day. Digital has changed things so much. It's more of a guide to point people in the right direction rather than a manual that says you must do this. If I told you how many times I've updated this thing and had to revise it since I first wrote it in 2011, I think I know I've lost count. But it's meant to be sort of a map, a guide for everyone to follow the best rules of journalism.
And there are some sort of basic ethical guidelines that all journalists follow, including freelancers and stringers, which are, they're very basic. They seem obvious, but you don't make things up. You don't attribute quotes to someone who didn't say it. You verify the information as much as possible. And I think the reason ethics are so important to all journalists is that it does a couple of things. It establishes very clear work lines. And you need that. You need, especially in the field when things can get a little fuzzy, you need very clear work lines. You need to understand what is considered ethical and what isn't. And second, I think ethics are very important because that establishes the credibility of your information and the credibility of your organization. If at some point you start to, if you have journalists who make things up or things aren't reported accurately, your news organization is going to lose credibility with the public, and you as a journalist will lose all credibility. And that's basically it's your reputation. It's what you are based on is that. So I think it's key. It's absolutely key that you have clear guidelines, that you establish that you are a credible source, and that your organization is considered a credible organization. I think that's sort of why ethics are so important.
How often do U.S. journalists suffer punishment if they violate the main ethical rules of journalism? And she continues to say that the thing is that in Ukraine, it often ends up with a magazine or a newspaper making an apology for posting false information, and that's all that happens. So what is the responsibility of a journalist for presenting incorrect information? Sharon, you kind of referred to that in your opening remarks in how you do your job as a journalist. Do you want to?
Well, I would think, first of all, that it's actually a very good step to issue an apology, and it should be on the front page of the website or the publication. Or some publications have it sort of on the first page down at the lower left. There's always one location, and it's the New York Times has issued apology You know, they got the date wrong. They got some information wrong. There's nothing wrong with issuing an apology. It's an admission that you did something wrong, and that's a good first step. But as far as journalists getting punished, they do. They absolutely do. If you get caught out, if you get caught lying, or you know, there's a New York journalist, New York Times, I think Jason Blair, invented things. You are out of a job. You are never hired again as a journalist. You've ruined your reputation. You're done. You're finished. As far as the industry here is concerned, so I think the punishment is actually it seems to be a peer-to-peer punishment. You know, you have let down the profession. That's not what we're about. Right. So I think the punishment can be sort of basically you're finished. You will not work as a journalist.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Sharon said. You know, the other thing about incorrect information, and it's an interesting way of phrasing it as incorrect information, which is different than lying. If you interviewed someone and that person gave you information on which you're basing your piece, now it would be your responsibility, at least it would be my responsibility or Sharon's responsibility, to get information that confirms that you're not just taking that person's word for it. So, you know, you might have to do a little bit of extra research based on that particular topic, whatever it may be. But let's say you didn't. Let's say you were working on deadline and person X told VOA or told whatever publication this, and you have a quote, you have this information. If it later turns out, whether it's a letter to, you know, a comment posted or a letter or something that says, by the way, your reporter got that information entirely wrong and you should check here. Now, if someone gives us incorrect information and we don't double check it, yes, we made a mistake in doing that, and we will issue an apology or a correction. That's different than a reporter falsifying information, lying, or putting something out there that they absolutely know is not true.
We have a question from Linda talking about ethical issues vary from country to country. And it's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. I've worked in many, many different countries. I've also worked for Agence France Presse, where I was the desk editor, chief editor for all our Latin American correspondents and all the French correspondents. And what I noticed was that the Latin American correspondents had a particular writing style, and the French correspondents had a particular writing style, and that tended to be more opinionated and editorial than what is normally the English language journalist style. And at first I was a little disconcerted about it, but then I realized, you know, this is exactly what Linda's bringing up. In Latin America, it is generally accepted that journalists present a point of view in their writing. In the French journalists, there seemed to be a variation. But there was also, it's almost like the journalists had a certain position in society where they could present something with a certain tone. In the United States and in England, that is not acceptable at all. And so, yeah, there probably are different interpretations or perspectives of what ethical journalism is. But overall, and regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, and I've dealt with many journalists around the world, there is an understanding that you don't lie, that you don't make things up, and that you always get a second perspective, that you don't only give one perspective on a story, that you always look to see the other side of the story. And it really doesn't matter where you fall and how you write it, but that is accepted everywhere. And there is an international code, and there's a freelancer code. You can go to the, I believe it's the Society of Journalism, the Committee for the Protection of Journalism.
CPJ, yeah.
CPJ has a code. There is an ethical code, and I really think that there are not really ethical considerations that don't apply. I think they all apply across the board. So that would be my answer to Linda.
And the other thing I'll say is that, you know, you can look at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Here in the U.S., we have the Society of Professional Journalists. We have various journalist organizations, and when I was putting this guide together, I looked at a lot of different organizations in terms of what their codes of conduct were for their journalists. And for the most part, as Sharon said, at least here in the States and in the UK, everyone is fairly consistent. We all have our own specific little concerns that we have to deal with based on the kind of organization we are. But when it comes to something that, as Linda put it, is a universal ethics code, yes, I would say it's universal. Our code of ethics, our best practices guide, we also have something called the Journalistic Code, which I think was written in 1994. What's curious about it is that it was written in 1994 and it only refers to radio, but the basic parts of it apply even 21 years later. And that is for every VOA journalist, whether you're staff, whether you're a freelancer, whether you're here in the States, whether you're in the Middle East, whether you're in Africa. It applies to anybody who is working for VOA in any capacity. Because if we're putting our name, the organization's name, on your report, we have to know that you're following the same ethical guidelines that we're following back here in DC.
I think there's also something else. Editors, it's not just journalists.
Mm-hmm.
Editors also need to follow an ethical code. They, sometimes an editor will tell you, I want this story, and I want it this way. And I have pushed back against editors and said, well, the story actually doesn't fall down those lines. The story is developing in this way. And they said, no, we want this perspective. And I'll be, well, I don't actually agree with you. I think we need to present both perspectives. I'm very respectful towards my editors, but I think that the ethical code applies equally to them, just as it does to journalists, equally to all of the management of any or a news organization, and I think that's important.
Okay, I'm from the Kosovo group, and I would love to make one question regarding the blogging thing. There are a lot of journalists who are asked to actually blog or to kind of be part of editor, like make this a 1 week essay or opinion. And I mean, I would love to know, you mentioned something about it, but I would love to know to what extent should journalists play the part of being critics and being opinionists and analyzing things in a not journalistic way? Because if you write as a journalist, but then within the same week you also have this 1 week writing for your newspaper, it means that you're kind of just mixing up. I mean, people cannot take you seriously, and you cannot be objective, as much objective as you want.
I have a couple of suggestions on that, and I'm sure Ethan will have his own, but you can do a number of things with a blog. One, you can have at the top of your blog, you can say the views presented here do not reflect those of the organization or do not reflect my personal views, whatever you want. You can have a disclaimer. My understanding of a blog is to be able to present information that perhaps could not make it into your story. It's a number of personal observations, details, but not necessarily personal opinion. And I know that seems to be a fine line, but for example, if I were in Cairo, when I was in Cairo, and I was reporting on what was happening in Tahrir Square, I was reporting on what's happening in Rabaa Adawiya, and those were my stories, my TV stories and so on. But there were a number of very small personal observations that I had, of how you could move through a crowd, or a woman who put a scarf around my head, that wouldn't necessarily go in a story, but were interesting. I can put personal observations in a blog without actually putting my personal opinion on the blog. And I think that's how I would do it. What about the ethics of publishing bloody images?
Bloody images.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Bloody images and those kind of images, that's something, unfortunately, that we're facing more and more and more. We actually had, after the, when we got the video of was it the Jordanian pilot
Oh, being burned alive. Right.
Being burned alive. We knew immediately. Let me start with this. One thing that VOA and, again, I would say most Western news organizations that I'm familiar with, we will not be a platform or a mouthpiece to put out what those kind of groups are doing, to give them a platform on which to present their views. In other words, we got video, we saw the video of this Jordanian fighter pilot being burned in a cage. That's gruesome. That's horrible. That's despicable. We need to tell the story, and we need to explain it as carefully, yet convey the horror of what was done to this person, but we don't necessarily feel that it's a good thing editorially to actually show our audience that video. There are ways we could have handled it. We could have told the story on our main page and then said something like, you know, click through to see the video or something like that. But generally speaking, the immediate reaction was, we're not going to show this happening. It's just too horrible to show people.
I think that there's somebody else spoke about ethics of different countries, and again, I've worked and lived in many, many different countries. In countries like Spain, for example, they will show images of people dead on the ground. In Pakistan, they showed images in the newspapers of people being killed, shot, you know, pieces of people being blown up, and so on. That really differs from country to country, the level of violence that's acceptable in a newspaper or on a website, and that's definitely a cultural perspective. Some countries have a very high level of tolerance of that. The U.S. happens to have a very low level of tolerance for that. I have slightly different opinions on this subject. I think that when you're covering a war, it is sometimes appropriate to show the brutality of a war, because at times the home audience forgets just how brutal war can be, and to make it a sort of to make it look cleaner than it is, or make it look nicer than it is not an accurate reflection of how bad war can be. And I've covered many wars, so I feel that it is important at a certain level to show the brutality of a war. But as Steve said, there are different ways of showing this. You can write about it. You don't have to shove someone's face in it. And there's certain things that I feel, no, you don't have to show. You do not have to show someone's head being sliced off. You do not have to show someone being burned alive. To me, that's a certain limit that I personally could never cross. I don't think I don't think I've ever seen written down, you cannot show this, you cannot do this. Again, there's some things that are generally acceptable, and it does vary from country to country. I perhaps would show a little bit more than the general American public is willing to accept, merely because I think it's important. But, you know, that is really up to each institution and how they, the New York Times may feel one way, VOA may feel another way, El País may feel another way. I guess I would do it that way.
But there's something I want to emphasize, and the more we've been talking, the more I realize it. You know, we're being given specific examples, and we're talking about specific examples, but what I want everyone to understand when it comes to making these kind of decisions, as Sharon said, there is no, it's not written anywhere that I've worked, you will not do this or you will show that. Everything is decided as it happens. There is no blanket, umbrella, however you want to describe it, set of words that will tell you every time this happens, you will do it this way. That is not the case. Every time something like this happens, there is a discussion. People send emails, people will come and look at video, people will discuss it, and then a decision is made. Just because it was done one way this week doesn't mean it's going to be done the same way next week. That's really important to remember. You can have all the guidelines you want, but when something like this happens, no matter what it may be, whether it's devastation, whether it's sensitive information about an individual, the discussion has to happen. It has to happen with your colleagues. It has to happen with your supervisor. And if you're working for an organization, it may have to go to the top person in your organization. But it should never be, oh, a month ago I did it this way, so I'm going to do it this way now. Don't fall into that trap. That's dangerous.
We have another question about, don't you think journalists are always subjective to a certain extent, no matter how much they try to be objective? They choose people that they interview, they choose the frame, they choose the angle, they choose the things they will present. I'd like to talk to that. I've been a journalist for 35 years, and one thing I have learned, and this is extremely hard to do, is that yes, you can be objective, but you have to sacrifice your personal feelings in order to do that. And I have been in many different situations where I felt very strongly against a certain group, for example, and I had to put those feelings away and give that group the chance to say their piece. It is a question of training, a real question of training. It is not something that comes naturally. It really doesn't. And I have trained myself year after year after year, and I've made mistakes in the past, to stay objective, to remove myself and remind myself that my job is to give information to my audience and to give as balanced a picture as I can. I'm going to give this person's opinion, that person's opinion, perhaps an analyst's opinion, and it really doesn't matter what I think. I decide who I interview? Yes. Doesn't necessarily mean I like who I'm interviewing. Doesn't necessarily mean I agree with whom I'm interviewing. I've chosen the people that have a reputation in their field. I've chosen the people who may represent a certain community. That doesn't mean I like them at all. It just means that I'm going to interview them. They are part of that particular story, and I'm going to interview them. And I have interviewed many people whom I don't like, and many people whom I just don't agree with, and they would never know it. They would never know how I feel. I've presented their points of view and tried to make it as broad as possible. When you frame a picture, you're right. You can say, look at this crowd, right? You can focus in on a crowd, looks like thousands of people. When you pull out, well, there were only 100. That's ethical. You're making a bad decision. If there are only 100 people, you say there are only 100 people. You don't misrepresent by framing a picture. That's not correct. You don't misrepresent in a story by only picking the people that you want to talk to. This falls down on the ethics story. But as far as being subjective, you train yourself to be objective. You really do. And there's no way out of it.